Whoa! Hold it right there!
I need that paper.
Remy was a bay quarter horse, 11 years old, and he had worked this land for 7 of those years. His coat had once been the deep, rich brown of polished mahogany, but time and poor feeding had pulled the shine from it. His ribs showed just enough that a trained eye would notice. His hooves had not been properly trimmed in months, the edges cracking and splitting in ways that made each step on the hard October ground more painful than the last. The muscles along his hindquarters had started to atrophy from underwork and inadequate nutrition, and the saddle sores along his back had healed and reopened so many times that the skin there had grown thick and calloused in an unnatural way. Still, every morning Remy was brought out. Still, every morning he was expected to perform. Dale Calloway was not a cruel man in the way that word usually gets applied. He was not someone who took pleasure in suffering. He simply did not think about the horse very much at all. Remy was a tool to him, the same as the tractor or the fence posts or the wire cutters hanging in the barn. Tools got used. Tools got worn out. When they stopped working the way they should, you pushed them harder or you replaced them. That was the logic Dale had grown up with. His father had run the property the same way. His grandfather before that. Nobody had ever told him there was another way to think about it, and nobody in his immediate circle had ever pushed back hard enough to make him reconsider. On that Tuesday morning, Dale had decided Remy would be used to help move cattle across the south pasture. It was not particularly hard work, but Remy had already been worked the 2 days prior without proper rest, and his water bucket had been knocked over sometime in the night and not refilled. The horse was thirsty, stiff, and moving with the careful deliberateness of an animal that was managing pain rather than ignoring it. 3 of Dale's workers stood by the fence as Remy was led out. Miguel, who had worked the property for 2 seasons, watched quietly from under the brim of his hat. He had noticed the horse's condition weeks ago, but had said nothing because jobs were not easy to find, and Dale was not the kind of man who welcomed observations from the people he paid. Beside him stood 2 younger men, barely out of their 20s, who were too new to the property to know what normal was supposed to look like and too uncertain of their positions to ask questions. Dale saddled Remy with the efficiency of a man who had done it 10,000 times and no longer saw the process at all. He tightened the girth strap without checking the sores underneath. He adjusted the bit without noticing how Remy's mouth was already dry and sticky from dehydration. Then he mounted, settled into the saddle, and clicked his tongue to move the horse forward toward the south pasture gate. Remy took 3 steps, then 2 more. Then he stopped. Not because Dale asked him to. Not because anything blocked the path. The horse simply stopped, standing absolutely still in the pale morning light, with his head hanging slightly lower than it should have been, and his sides moving with the slow, labored rhythm of an animal that is working harder just to breathe than it should be working. Dale nudged with his heels. Nothing. He nudged harder. Remy's skin flinched along his flank, the way a horse's skin moves to shake off a fly, but his hooves did not move. Dale made a sharp sound with his mouth and pressed his heels in again, this time with real pressure. Remy took 1 step forward, stumbled slightly on his cracked front hoof, and then went completely, terrifyingly still. 3 seconds passed. 3 seconds in which nobody moved. 3 seconds in which the only sounds were the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the dried October grass, and the shallow, struggling breath of an 11-year-old horse who had simply run out of the ability to pretend he was fine. Miguel's hand tightened around the fence post he was leaning against. His knuckles went pale. He had seen horses before. He had seen tired horses and hungry horses and frightened horses. But this was something different. This was a horse that had gone somewhere beyond tired. This was a horse that was standing at the exact edge of what a living thing can endure before the body simply stops cooperating with the demands being placed on it. The 3 seconds stretched. Nobody spoke. Dale shifted in the saddle, impatient. The two younger men stared at the ground. And then, from the far end of the driveway, a truck turned in from the county road. A dark green pickup, moving slowly, with the careful pace of someone who was reading the land rather than rushing across it. Behind the wheel was a woman named Sandra Voss, a large animal veterinarian from the county extension office who had received an anonymous tip the previous afternoon. A tip that had given her the address of the Calloway property and 3 short words written in the message box of the online report form. The 3 words were, "Please come today." Nobody on the property had been expecting her. Nobody had called the extension office. Nobody, as far as Dale Calloway knew, had said a single word to anyone outside those fence lines about what was happening to a bay quarter horse named Remy on a farm at the edge of Millbrook County, Tennessee. But someone had watched. Someone had decided that silence, this time, was not something they were willing to keep. Sandra Voss pulled her truck to a stop 20 feet from where Dale sat on the motionless horse. She stepped out slowly, her eyes already moving across Remy with the practiced, clinical attention of someone who had spent 20 years learning how to read an animal's body the way other people read a page of text. She did not look at Dale yet. She looked at the horse. She looked at the hooves, the ribs, the dull eyes, the labored breathing, the way Remy's head hung with a heaviness that was not exhaustion alone. Then she looked up at Dale Calloway, and the expression on her face was not anger. It was something worse than anger. It was the calm, settled, completely unshakable look of a person who already knows exactly what she is looking at and exactly what she is going to do about it. She said quietly, "Sir, I need you to get off that horse right now." Dale Calloway did not get off the horse right away. That was the first thing people who later heard the story always found surprising. They assumed that when a county veterinarian pulls up in an official truck and tells you to dismount, a reasonable person would simply dismount. But Dale Calloway was not thinking about what a reasonable person would do. He was thinking about what he had always done on this property, which was exactly what he wanted, in exactly the order he wanted, without input from strangers who had no business turning into his driveway on a Tuesday morning without an invitation. He looked down at Sandra Voss from his position in the saddle and said, with the flat confidence of a man who had never once been told what to do on his own land, that she could state her business from where she was standing, and then she could leave the same way she came in. Sandra did not react the way he expected. She did not raise her voice. She did not reach for a phone or a clipboard, or any of the props people reach for when they want to signal authority. She simply walked forward, slowly, and came to stand directly beside Remy. She placed her hand flat against the horse's neck. She was checking his skin temperature. She was noting the way he flinched, even at a gentle touch. She was watching his nostrils. She was counting his breaths. All of this happened in about 15 seconds. And in those 15 seconds, Dale realized something that made the back of his jaw tighten. She was not here to argue with him. She was here to document. Sandra looked up at him again and said that under Tennessee state law, she had the authority to conduct a welfare inspection on any large animal in visible physical distress, and that what she was looking at constituted visible physical distress. She said it the way a person says something they have said before, in courtrooms and on farm driveways, and in telephone hearings with property owners who did not want to hear it. Then she said it again, very clearly. She needed him to get off the horse. This time, Dale got off. He did it slowly and with a particular kind of deliberateness that was meant to communicate that he was choosing to cooperate rather than being made to. He stepped down from the saddle and stood with his arms folded and his face set in the expression of a man who is being deeply inconvenienced. Behind him, Miguel had gone very still against the fence. The two younger workers had taken several steps backward, creating the kind of distance that people create when they sense that a situation is about to turn into something they do not want to be in the middle of. Sandra moved around Remy slowly and methodically. She checked his eyes, lifting each lid gently to look at the membrane coloring underneath. She ran her hands along his spine, pressing carefully at intervals, watching his reaction. She crouched and examined each hoof, and when she reached the front left hoof, she stayed there for a long moment without speaking. The crack in that hoof ran deep, too deep, the kind of deep that meant the horse had been walking on it for weeks without anyone deciding the damage was worth addressing. She took photographs. She used a small thermometer. She asked one of the younger workers to fill a water bucket, and when the worker looked to Dale for confirmation, and Dale gave a slight, tight nod, the bucket was filled and brought over. Remy drank for a long time without stopping. He drank the way a horse drinks when it has been thirsty for longer than it should have been, and watching it made the morning feel quieter than it already was. Dale told Sandra that the horse was fine, that horses looked like this in the fall, that working horses were different from show horses, and if she had spent more time on real working farms, she would understand that. He said it all with the measured authority of someone who had said similar things before and had generally been believed. Sandra wrote in her notebook while he talked. What Dale did not know, and what Sandra had known since she pulled into the driveway, was that the tip she had received the day before had not come alone. It had come with photographs. Someone on this property, or someone who had visited it recently, had taken photographs over what appeared to be a span of several weeks. The photographs showed Remy at different times of day, in different lighting, and they showed a progression that was difficult to argue with. They showed a horse losing weight steadily. They showed hooves deteriorating without treatment. They showed a saddle sore that had never been given time to heal properly. They showed, across weeks of documentation, what a single morning inspection might only partially capture. Sandra had printed those photographs, and they were in a folder in her truck. She had not told Dale this yet. Someone on this property, or someone who had visited it recently, had taken photographs over what appeared to be a span of several weeks. The photographs showed Remy at different times of day, in different lighting, and they showed a progression that was difficult to argue with. They showed a horse losing weight steadily. They showed hooves deteriorating without treatment. They showed a saddle sore that had never been given time to heal properly. They showed, across weeks of documentation, what a single morning inspection might only partially capture. Sandra had printed those photographs, and they were in a folder in her truck. She had not told Dale this yet. She finished her physical examination and stood up and wrote several more things in her notebook. Then she looked at Dale and told him, in the same calm voice she had used throughout, that she was placing Remy under an immediate welfare hold. That meant the horse could not be worked, moved off the property, sold, or otherwise transferred until the hold was reviewed. She told him she would be returning the following morning with a colleague, and that there would be a formal written report filed with the county within 48 hours. She told him that he had the right to contact an attorney if he wished, and that she would recommend he do so. Dale's face changed. The tight, controlled expression cracked slightly at the edges. He asked her what exactly she thought she was doing. He asked her on what authority. He asked her who had called her and what they had told her. Sandra told him she was not able to share that information. She told him the report was on file and that the process would move forward according to state procedure. She told him she was leaving a written notice of the hold on his door and that she would see him tomorrow morning. Then she walked back to her truck, placed her notebook on the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove back down the driveway the same slow way she had come in. Dale stood in the paddock with his arms still folded and his jaw working silently. Remy stood beside the fence where one of the younger workers had quietly tied his lead rope. The horse's head was still low. His eyes were still dull. But the water bucket was empty now, and something in the rigid line of his exhausted body had shifted very slightly, as if some small internal alarm had been turned down by a single degree. Miguel did not look at Dale when he walked past him toward the barn. He kept his face forward and his footsteps steady and he did not stop. He had been the one who found the reporting form online 6 days ago. He had been the one who spent 40 minutes typing and deleting and retyping a description of what he had been watching happen to Remy for weeks. He had attached the photographs he had been taking quietly on his phone every few days since August, always when Dale's truck was gone and the property was still. He had pressed submit and then sat in his truck in the dark for a long time, not moving. He had not told anyone. He had gone back to work the next morning, the same as always, and the morning after that, and every morning since, because the rent was due, and because he did not know if anything would come of it, and because being the person who called the county on your employer was not something you did lightly when you had a family to feed and a record of being the kind of man who did not cause problems. But he had submitted it, and Sandra had come. And now Remy was standing at the fence with an empty water bucket at his feet and a welfare hold on his file. And Dale Calloway was still standing in the middle of his paddock with his arms folded, staring at the spot where the green truck had been, working out what he was going to do next. The cattle lowed from the south pasture. The wind moved through the dried grass. And the morning kept going, the way mornings do, even after something irreversible has already happened in them. He did not know what it meant, that the woman with the calm voice had come and gone and left something behind that made the tall man with the folded arms stand very still for a long time in the middle of the paddock. He did not understand the paperwork or the photographs or the forms filed in a county office he had never seen and never would. What he knew was the paddock, the fence, the barn at the far end that smelled of hay and old wood, and the particular dusty warmth of animals that had sheltered in the same place for many years. He knew the sound of the water bucket and the feel of the dry October grass under his cracked hooves, and the way the morning light came through the gaps in the fence boards at a low angle that sometimes hit his eyes directly and made him turn his head. She was not here to argue with him. She was here to document. Sandra looked up at him again and said that under Tennessee state law, she had the authority to conduct a welfare inspection on any large animal in visible physical distress, and that what she was looking at constituted visible physical distress. She said it the way a person says something they have said before, in courtrooms and on farm driveways, and in telephone hearings with property owners who did not want to hear it. Then she said it again, very clearly. She needed him to get off the horse. This time, Dale got off. He did it slowly and with a particular kind of deliberateness that was meant to communicate that he was choosing to cooperate rather than being made to. He stepped down from the saddle and stood with his arms folded and his face set in the expression of a man who is being deeply inconvenienced. Behind him, Miguel had gone very still against the fence. The two younger workers had taken several steps backward, creating the kind of distance that people create when they sense that a situation is about to turn into something they do not want to be in the middle of. Sandra moved around Remy slowly and methodically. She checked his eyes, lifting each lid gently to look at the membrane coloring underneath. She ran her hands along his spine, pressing carefully at intervals, watching his reaction. She crouched and examined each hoof, and when she reached the front left hoof, she stayed there for a long moment without speaking. The crack in that hoof ran deep, too deep, the kind of deep that meant the horse had been walking on it for weeks without anyone deciding the damage was worth addressing. She took photographs. She used a small thermometer. She asked one of the younger workers to fill a water bucket, and when the worker looked to Dale for confirmation, and Dale gave a slight, tight nod, the bucket was filled and brought over. Remy drank for a long time without stopping. He drank the way a horse drinks when it has been thirsty for longer than it should have been, and watching it made the morning feel quieter than it already was. Dale told Sandra that the horse was fine, that horses looked like this in the fall, that working horses were different from show horses, and if she had spent more time on real working farms, she would understand that. He said it all with the measured authority of someone who had said similar things before and had generally been believed. Sandra wrote in her notebook while he talked. What Dale did not know, and what Sandra had known since she pulled into the driveway, was that the tip she had received the day before had not come alone. It had come with photographs. He knew he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the morning. He knew the tiredness lived somewhere deeper than his muscles. He knew it in the way horses know things, which is not through thought, but through the body, as an accumulated weight pressing steadily inward, one day adding to the next, the way water slowly fills a low place in the ground. After Sandra left, nobody approached him for several hours. The two younger workers disappeared into the barn. Miguel stayed close to the fence line on the far side of the property, working steadily on a section of wire that needed repairing, his back to the paddock and his movements deliberate and unhurried. Dale's truck left the property around mid-morning and did not come back until late afternoon. In those quiet hours, something changed for Remy in a way that was small and almost invisible. Someone brought him a second bucket of water without being asked. It was one of the younger workers, a boy named Trevor, who was 22 years old and had grown up in a suburb outside Nashville and who had come to the Callaway property looking for the kind of physical, uncomplicated work that city life had never offered him. Trevor had watched everything that happened that morning from his position by the fence without saying a single word. He had watched Sandra examine the horse. He had watched Dale's face. He had watched Miguel walk past Dale without looking at him, which Trevor somehow understood, without being told, was the bravest thing anyone had done that morning. He filled the bucket from the barn tap and brought it to Remy without ceremony, setting it down carefully on the level ground near the fence post. Then he stood back and watched the horse drink, and something moved through the boy's chest that he would have been embarrassed to name out loud, but that was, in its simplest form, the feeling of having done one right thing in a morning full of wrong ones. That evening, Sandra Voss sat at her kitchen table with her notes spread in front of her and made 3 phone calls. The first was to her supervisor at the county extension office to formally log the welfare hold and begin the process of scheduling the follow-up inspection. The second was to a large animal rehabilitation facility 2 hours north of Millbrook County called Blue Ridge Recovery, run by a woman named Carolyn Marsh, who had been taking in compromised horses for 18 years, and who Sandra had worked with many times before. Sandra told Carolyn that she might have a case coming her way in the next week or two, and described what she had seen. Carolyn listened without interrupting, and then said she had a paddock available and to send her the photographs when Sandra was ready. The third call was the hardest one. It went to the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. Sandra did not know, when she picked up the phone, whether the photographs and the physical assessment would be enough to support a criminal neglect charge under Tennessee law. She had been doing this work for 20 years, and she still found that part unpredictable. What she knew was that the documentation existed, and that it was her job to put it in front of the people who would decide what happened next. She spoke to a deputy she had worked with before, a woman named Anita Pierce, who handled agricultural crime cases for the department. She described what she had seen. She described the photographs she had received. She said she believed it was a pattern of neglect extending over multiple weeks and that it was documented. Deputy Pierce said she would come by Sandra's office in the morning before the reinspection and look at the file. Sandra thanked her and hung up the phone and sat for a moment with her hands folded on the table, looking at the photographs printed on the page in front of her. She looked at Remy's ribs in August, and then in September, and then the photograph from the report form that had been taken sometime in early October. She looked at the hooves. She looked at the saddle sore visible in one of the photographs, a raw pink wound that was partly hidden by the girth, but visible enough if you knew what you were looking for. She thought about Remy standing in that paddock at dawn, not moving. 3 seconds of absolute stillness that had communicated more clearly than any report form or photograph could what was happening to that horse. She turned the photograph over so she didn't have to look at it anymore and went to bed. The next morning arrived the way autumn mornings do in Tennessee, cold and gray at the edges and slow to brighten. Sandra arrived at the Calloway property at 8:15 with Deputy Pierce beside her in the county truck. They had spent 40 minutes at the extension office going through the photographs and Sandra's notes from the previous day and the Moss documentation submitted with the original report. Deputy Pierce had asked precise, professional questions. She had written things down in her own notebook. She had not said whether she thought it was enough for a charge. She had simply said they would go look. He had handled animal neglect cases before. Not many, because they were underreported in rural counties in ways that everyone who worked in agricultural law enforcement understood and nobody fully knew how to fix, but enough that he had a sense of what they looked like and what they required to go anywhere meaningful in a legal proceeding. Most of them involved a combination of documentation and testimony, and a judge who either took the welfare of livestock seriously or did not. And those two outcomes produced very different results in very similar cases. Paul Eddings had seen both enough times to know that the law was consistent, but its application was not, and that the difference often came down to how clearly the suffering could be demonstrated. He reviewed Sandra's report and the photographs on a Thursday morning, 9 days after the original inspection. He reviewed Deputy Pierce's report. He reviewed the photographs submitted with the original anonymous tip which Sandra had provided to the department along with everything else. He reviewed Remy's weight documentation and the body condition scoring and the veterinary assessment of the hooves and the saddle sores and the dehydration indicators. He called Sandra that afternoon and asked her 2 questions. The first was whether she would be willing to testify. She said yes without hesitation. The second was whether she could reach the person who had submitted the original report. Sandra said she did not know who that was, because the reporting system was anonymous, and she had not attempted to trace it. That was true. What was also true was that Miguel, the day after the reinspection, had called Sandra's office and left a message identifying himself as the person who had filed the report and saying that he would speak to whoever needed to speak to him if it would help Remy. Sandra had returned his call and listened to him for a long time. She had asked him if he was prepared for the possibility that Dale Calloway would learn he had filed the report. Miguel had been quiet for a moment and then said that Dale would find out eventually anyway, and that at this point it did not change anything. He had made his decision 6 days ago when he sat in his truck in the dark and pressed submit, and he was not going back from it. Sandra told Paul Eddings about the call. She gave him Miguel's number. She let that process move forward the way it was supposed to. The criminal complaint was filed on a Tuesday, 3 weeks to the day after Remy had stood still in the paddock for 3 seconds that changed everything. The charge was criminal animal abuse under Tennessee Code Annotated 3914202, a Class A misdemeanor with a second count related to failure to provide adequate veterinary care. Dale Calloway was summoned to appear before the Millbrook County General Sessions Court within 30 days. On the same Tuesday the complaint was filed, Remy was transported to Blue Ridge Recovery. The trailer ride took 2.5 hours on winding county roads, and then state highway, and then a long gravel driveway that climbed slightly into the foothills above the valley. Carolyn Marsh was standing in the open gate when the trailer pulled in, the way she was always standing in the gate when a new horse arrived, because she believed that the first thing a horse in distress should experience at a new place was a human being standing calmly in the open air waiting for it. The trailer ramp came down. Remy hesitated at the top of it, his cracked front hooves testing the angle carefully. The autumn light was different up here in the hills, cleaner and more open, and a cold breeze came down off the ridge carrying the smell of pine and turned leaves and something that horses with good memories associate with the presence of other horses. Remy came down the ramp slowly. His head was still low, and his eyes were still that dull, carefully maintained neutral that animals use when they are protecting themselves from expecting too much. He walked into the receiving paddock with the measured, cautious steps of a horse that had learned to anticipate pain from the ground and was always checking the footing before committing to it. Carolyn let him stand. She did not approach immediately. She stood at the fence to let the horse figure out the new smells and sounds and the particular quality of the silence in this place, which was different from the silence of the Calloway property in ways that could not be described, but that an animal would register in its body before its mind. After about 10 minutes, Remy lifted his head. Not dramatically, not with any sudden shift in energy. Just a slow raise of the neck, an inch or two, to look across the paddock toward the far field where 3 other horses were grazing in the late afternoon light. Carolyn exhaled very quietly. It was the smallest possible good sign, and she had learned in 18 years to treat small good signs with absolute seriousness. A farrier arrived the next morning. His name was Grant, and he had been working with Carolyn for 11 years, and he was the kind of man who approached a compromised hoof the way a careful person approaches a locked door, with patience and precision and no wasted motion. He spent 2 hours with Remy that day, working slowly and talking quietly the whole time, which was not something he did with every horse, but which he did instinctively with the ones who had come in from situations like Remy's, because something in the voice, the calm and directionless sound of it, seemed to tell the horse's body that the person handling it was not in a hurry and did not intend harm. By the end of the 2nd week, Remy was eating consistently. Not greedily, not with the frantic energy of a horse that has been genuinely starved, but steadily, the way an animal eats when it begins to trust that the next meal will also come. His water intake was regular. He had been given a mild anti-inflammatory that the vet on Carolyn's team had prescribed after a full assessment, and the combination of the medication and the correct footing in the paddock meant that his movement was becoming more fluid, the rigid, careful placing of feet giving way gradually to something closer to a natural walk. The saddle sores were being treated daily. The skin that was healing slowly, the way compromised skin always heals slowly, but healing. Sandra drove up to Blue Ridge Recovery on a Saturday in November and stood at the fence of Remy's paddock for a while without going in. She watched him move across the space. She watched the way his head sat, higher now than it had in the photographs. She watched the small things, the twitch of his ears when a crow called from the pines at the far edge of the property, the shift of his weight as he turned to look at her standing at the fence. The eyes were different, still guarded, the way the eyes of a horse with his history are always guarded, but not entirely flat anymore. There was something present behind them that had not been there on the morning she first pulled into the Calloway driveway. Dale Calloway was standing on his porch when the truck pulled in. He had a cup of coffee in one hand and his attorney on the phone in the other. He had called the attorney the previous evening, which was exactly what Sandra had expected, and exactly why she had called Deputy Pierce when she did, so that the formal record was started before any legal maneuvering could complicate the timeline. He ended the call when he saw Deputy Pierce step out of the truck. His expression was careful and managed. What happened in the next 90 minutes on the Calloway property would later be described by Deputy Pierce in her official report as a textbook documentation visit. She and Sandra moved through it professionally, methodically, and without drama. They examined Remy again. They compared what they observed to the photographs from the weeks prior. They measured his weight against the expected range for a horse of his age and size and breed. They photographed the hooves in detail, particularly the front left. They documented the saddle sores. They documented the body condition score, which placed Remy at a level that, under Tennessee animal welfare standards, crossed a clearly defined threshold. Dale stood at the edge of all of this with his attorney on speakerphone and his face working through a series of expressions that he was not quite able to control. He said several things. He said the horse had always looked like this in the fall. He said the hoof was a recent injury. He said he was planning to call the farrier next week anyway. Nobody wrote any of that down. What they wrote down was what they could measure and photograph and verify. When it was over, Deputy Pierce turned to Dale Calloway and told him she would be filing a report with the county prosecutor's office, and that he should expect to hear from that office within the week. She told him the welfare hold would remain in place, and that under the terms of the hold, a county-approved veterinarian would be responsible for Remy's care during the hold period. She told him he was not being arrested. She told him what happened next would depend on the prosecutor's review. Dale did not say anything. His face had settled into something that was no longer performing control. It was something older and plainer than control. Something that looked, if you caught it at the right angle in the gray October morning light, like a man slowly understanding that the thing he thought was only his problem had become, somehow, everyone's problem. Miguel was not on the property that morning. He had called in to say he had a family matter to attend to. It was the first day he had ever missed on the Calloway property in 2 seasons of work. Remy stood at the fence the whole time, watching. The county prosecutor's name was Paul Eddings, and he had been doing his job in Millbrook County for 14 years. She did not name what she was feeling as she stood there. She was a scientist and a professional, and she was disciplined about the language she used around her cases. But she stood at that fence for a long time, longer than she needed to, because the situation seemed to call for someone to simply be present and witness the fact that this horse was still here and was going to keep being here. Meanwhile, the legal process ground forward with its own careful rhythm. Dale Calloway, through his attorney, attempted to have the charges reduced on the grounds that the horse had received adequate care and that the documented conditions were consistent with normal variation in working horses. The prosecutor disagreed. The photographs disagreed. The sequential body condition scores disagreed. Miguel's testimony, given in a formal deposition conducted in the county courthouse on a gray November morning, disagreed clearly and specifically, and with the kind of detail that comes from a person who had watched something happen over weeks and had kept a careful account of it in his own mind long before he pressed submit on an anonymous report form. The court date was set for December, and in a paddock in the Blue Ridge foothills, an 11-year-old bay horse stood in the late autumn light with his head slightly higher than it had been, eating steadily, watching the other horses in the far field, and not flinching when the farrier's hands came near his feet. The General Sessions courtroom in Millbrook County was a small room with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly, and windows that looked out onto the courthouse parking lot. It was the kind of room that felt like it had absorbed the weight of 100 ordinary griefs over many decades, the way old wood absorbs weather, and it smelled faintly of paper and carpet cleaner and the particular dry warmth of an overheated public building. Dale Calloway arrived with his attorney on a Wednesday morning in the second week of December. He was dressed in a way that suggested someone else had given thought to what he should wear. Pressed dark slacks and a collared shirt that did not look like anything he would have chosen himself. He sat at the defendant's table with his hands folded and his jaw set and his eyes pointed steadily forward, and the overall effect was of a man who had decided in advance on an expression and was committing to it regardless of what the morning produced. Sandra sat in the gallery beside Deputy Pierce. Miguel sat 2 rows back, between a woman who was presumably his wife and an older gentleman who had the quiet, rooted bearing of a father accompanying an adult child through something difficult. Miguel had not looked at Dale since entering the room. He was looking at the bench, at the seal of the state of Tennessee mounted above it, at a fixed point somewhere in the middle distance that he was using to keep himself steady. The judge was a woman named Harriet Colum, who had been on the bench in Millbrook County for 9 years, and who was known, among the attorneys who appeared before her regularly, for asking precise questions and tolerating inexact answers very poorly. She entered the courtroom, took her seat, reviewed something on the page in front of her for a moment, and then looked up. The proceedings moved with the measured pace of legal proceedings everywhere, exhibits were entered. Sandra testified about what she had observed on both inspection visits and answered detailed questions from the prosecutor about body condition scoring methodology and what the documented scores indicated under Tennessee welfare standards. She answered cross-examination from Dale's attorney with the same steady, factual precision she had maintained throughout the case, and when the attorney suggested that working horses often showed physical variation that could be misread by observers unfamiliar with the demands of ranch life, Sandra looked at him calmly and said that she had been assessing working horses for 20 years, and that what she had documented at the Callaway property was not variation. It was deterioration. And there was a difference. Miguel's testimony was quiet and exact. He was not dramatic. He did not embellish. He described what he had seen on specific dates in specific terms. He described the water bucket being knocked over and not replaced. He described the condition of the hooves over the course of the preceding months. He described the morning routine and how Remy had been worked without adequate rest on multiple consecutive days. He described taking the photographs and why. When the attorney asked him why he had chosen to report anonymously rather than speaking directly to his employer, Miguel looked at the attorney for a moment before answering, and then said that he had known from the beginning that Dale would not change what he was doing, and that he was correct about that, and that the only way anything was going to change for the horse was if someone with the authority to enforce change got involved. He said he had weighed that against the risk to his job and his family, and that he had not made the decision lightly. The attorney did not have a useful follow-up question to that. The courtroom was quiet for a moment. Judge Colum asked several questions of her own during the testimony, the kind of pointed, detailed questions that confirmed she had read the file thoroughly and that she understood exactly what she was looking at. She asked Sandra about the timeline of the documented decline in Remy's body condition. She asked whether a horse showing a body condition score at the documented level could have arrived at that condition through circumstances outside the owner's control. Sandra said it was theoretically possible in an emergency situation, but that the photographic documentation across multiple weeks showed a steady and preventable progression. The judge nodded, wrote something on her notepad, and thanked Sandra for her testimony. The defense offered its case. A.L. Callaway did not testify. His attorney argued that the conditions were consistent with the normal physical demands placed on a working ranch horse, and that there was no evidence of deliberate cruelty, only of a difference in care philosophy between the defendant and the county authorities. He cited the defendant's long history as a property owner and livestock manager with no prior complaints. He asked for the charges to be dismissed. Judge Colum listened to all of it without visible expression. She asked 3 questions when the defense finished. Each question was short and precise, and each answer either failed to fully respond or retreated into general statements that the judge did not appear to find satisfying. When the final answer was given, she made a note and called a short recess. When she returned, the room was quiet in the specific way that rooms get quiet when everyone in them is waiting for something that cannot be undone once it is said. Judge Colum found Dale Callaway guilty on both counts. She imposed a fine, community service hours with a county animal welfare organization, and a supervised probationary period during which any livestock on his property would be subject to regular inspection by the county extension office. She also issued a formal order prohibiting him from owning horses for a period of 5 years. She stated in her ruling, reading from her notes with the unhurried precision of someone who had thought carefully about exactly what she wanted the record to reflect, that the evidence demonstrated a sustained pattern of inadequate care that had produced measurable and preventable harm to an animal in the defendant's charge, and that the court took the welfare of animals under human care seriously, and expected that the outcome of this proceeding would serve as a clear statement about what the law in this county required of the people who held responsibility for those animals. Dale sat through all of it with the same fixed forward expression he had arrived with. He did not look at Miguel. He did not look at Sandra. He looked at the bench, and then at the table in front of him, and then at his attorney, and then the courtroom began to move around him with the business of wrapping up a concluded matter. Outside on the courthouse steps, in the sharp December air, Sandra stood for a moment and breathed. Miguel came out a few minutes later with his wife and the older man, who was indeed his father, who had driven 4 hours from Memphis that morning to be in the room. Miguel shook hands with Deputy Pierce, and then turned to Sandra and said thank you, and Sandra said that he was the one who had made it happen, that without the photographs and the report, the case would have been much harder. Miguel nodded slowly. He did not say what he was thinking, which was that for 6 days after pressing submit, he had been certain he had made a mistake, that nothing would come of it, that he had risked his livelihood for no reason. He did not say that anymore. He said thank you again, and then walked down the steps with his family toward the parking lot. Carolyn Marsh drove down from the hills on a Saturday in late January with Remy in the trailer, not to return him, but to let him run in a different field for a while, on a property that belonged to a friend of hers, who had a wide flat pasture and 3 gentle mares, who are known for being easy with newcomers. She had been doing this with her longer stay horses for years, taking them out into the world gradually and watching how they moved in new spaces. She let the trailer ramp down at the edge of the flat pasture and stood back. Remy came down the ramp. He stood at the bottom and looked at the field. The grass was winter pale but wide and open in the low January light. The 3 mares were at the far end, barely visible. The sky was enormous, and the air was cold and clean and completely different from any air Remy had stood in for a long time. He lifted his head all the way. His ears moved forward. Something in the long muscles of his neck and shoulders released, a visible softening that Carolyn, who had watched this moment happen with many horses over many years, recognized immediately as the thing she was always waiting to see. It was not happiness, exactly. It was something more fundamental than happiness. It was the body deciding on its own terms and in its own time that the world it currently occupied was not something it needed to brace against. He moved into the field at a walk, then a trot. Then, with a kind of self-surprising acceleration that made Carolyn press her hand briefly to her mouth, he ran, not a cautious run, not the careful movement of a horse still protecting its feet. A real run, a full, open, blowing through the winter morning run, down the length of the flat pasture with his head up and his mane lifting and the 3 mares turning to watch him come. He never returned to the Calloway property. He never stood in that paddock again. He never felt a girth tightened over an unhealed wound or a heel pressed into his side when his body had already given everything it had. The farrier came to Blue Ridge every 6 weeks and talked quietly while he worked and left the hooves, in a state of clean functionality that Remy could feel in every step. He was adopted the following spring by a family with 2 daughters and a small property on the east side of the county, people who had been on Carolyn's waiting list for 2 years and who had been told, when she called them about Remy, that he would need patience and time and the particular kind of stillness that horses with difficult histories require. They had said they understood. They had driven up to meet him and had stood quietly at the fence of his paddock for a long time before trying to approach, which Carolyn took as a very good sign. He was not a horse who ran competition or performed tricks or did anything that would ever appear in a video or a county fair program. He was a horse who stood in a field in the morning and let 2 girls brush him with soft brushes and bring him apples, cut into careful slices, and who, over months and then over a year, stopped flinching at sudden movements and started coming to the fence when he heard familiar voices. He never forgot what had happened to him. Horses do not forget the way humans sometimes wish they could. The memory was in his body, in the way he still sometimes tested the ground before committing to a new step, in the slight hesitation he showed around strangers before deciding they were safe. But memory and the present do not always weigh the same amount, and over time, the the present began to weigh more. Nobody in Millbrook County talked much about the case after a year or two. It became one of those things that happened and produced a result, and then settled into the background of ordinary county life. Dale Calloway sold the property in the spring, following the court ruling, and moved north to be near his sister's family. The two young workers found other jobs. Trevor, the one who had carried the second bucket of water to Remy on that first morning, went back to Nashville and eventually started a small landscaping company. He kept a photograph on his phone, not of himself or anyone he knew, but of a bay horse standing in a wide flat field in January, with its head lifted and its mane moving, and 3 marais turning to watch it arrive. He did not know why he kept it. He just knew he did not want to delete it. And Miguel found work on a different property 20 miles east of the county line, a smaller operation with fewer horses, but better ones, horses that were handled carefully and fed well and given Sundays off. He did not talk about what he had done at the Calloway property with anyone except his wife and his father, and eventually his oldest son, who was 12 and who listened to the whole story one evening, and then asked his father if he had been scared when he submitted the report. Miguel thought about it for a moment and said yes. His son asked what had made him do it anyway. Miguel looked at the window for a while and then said, because 3 seconds of stillness in a paddock is the loudest thing he had ever heard in his life. And once you hear something like that, you do not get to pretend you did not. The horse never ran again in competition, but she never feared humans either. She ran for herself now, on cold mornings in wide fields, when the air was right and her body was ready and no one was asking anything of her at all. And that, it turned out, was more than enough.